last time talking about dinosaurs. We talked about how the dinosaur soft tissue discoveries are strong evidence that dinosaurs did not go extinct 65 million years ago, but have lived much more recently. The soft tissue can't survive millions of years, and this was something that was universally accepted among people who thought they were 65 million years old until those discoveries happened. And that was what led so many to immediately criticize the findings and dismiss that they couldn't possibly be actual soft tissue discoveries. But that has been validated. So then the question becomes, for them, not to question how these are these really 65 million years old, but to say, how could soft tissue last 65 million years? They won't question that aspect of how old they are. And then adding to that, the carbon-14 dating should be impossible on that soft tissue if it is indeed over 100,000 years old even. It should not have any detectable carbon-14, but they do. Another indication that they lived much more recently than 65 million years. And that carbon-14 exists in all sorts of things that it shouldn't, like coal, diamonds, natural gas, oil. Everywhere that the carbon-14 is in something organic but supposedly millions of years old should be carbon-14 dead, but it isn't. So that kind of leads into the question of, we're always taught in school that dinosaurs lived long before man, that humans have only been around for hundreds of thousands of years. Maybe some early humans or human-like creatures lived a couple million years old. But the dinosaurs were way before that, 65 million years. So the idea of them coexisting, it's part of that worldview is that never happened. But if this evidence is showing that dinosaurs are younger than 100,000 years old, then even with the evolutionist timeline, that would indicate that they did coexist. But that threatens sort of their whole paradigm, so they don't want to acknowledge that. That's why they look for excuses for why this soft tissue should last 65 million years, but it would still be impossible. They don't have an explanation for that at all. So then that leads into the question people ask sometimes, why aren't dinosaurs mentioned in the Bible? There's an assumption in that question that people don't realize they're making, and that's they're looking for the word dinosaur, but that word didn't exist until 1841. It was coined by an English paleontologist, Sir Richard Owen, and it just means great reptile, or basically a very large reptile or lizard. So they coined that term, or he coined that term, based on some of these fossils that were being discovered. So then the question is, what would those have been called before, right? Like, because the Bible's older than 1841. It's even translated into English in the middle of that millennium. The King James Bible was translated in 1611. And then the scriptures that they're based on in Greek and Hebrew are much older than that even. So if they're ever referencing dinosaurs, they're not going to be called dinosaurs because that word is a relatively recent invention. So if we go back to Genesis 1, we read the account of when God created animals on day 5 and day 6. And on day 5, he created, according to the scriptures, creatures that lived in the water or that flew in the air. And on day 6, he created creatures that live on land, as well as mankind, Adam and Eve specifically. So we're given these categories, and again, this is translated into English from Hebrew, and anytime you're translating a language, there's judgment calls that have to be made because there isn't always a perfect parallel in one language to a word in another language. So sometimes a word can have a broader meaning, like English in particular has a lot of kind of specific words, whereas Hebrew might have words that are more broad in definition, where we might have multiple words that all fit into one word in Hebrew. And you see this, if you compare different English translations, you can kind of see some of these judgment calls varying depending on who's translating it, and sort of get a sense of how that works. So in day 5 here, I kind of put the categories in different colors to make them stand out when they're mentioned more than once. So God said, let the waters abound with an abundance of living creatures, and so that'd be, anything that lives in the water, and let birds fly above the earth across the face of the firmament of the heavens, so things that fly in the sky. So here, the word bird is not limited to what we think of as birds, but it's really anything that flies. But we don't have a word for that in English, right? So if you said flying creatures, this is New King James that I have here, just as an example. It would read, let flying creatures fly. It's a little clumsy. So it's not that bird's a bad translation, it's just, it's not perfectly precise for what the word that's being translated means. For instance, this could include flying insects. It does include bats, and we're going to get to that. So on day 6, you have these different categories of land animals. So you've got cattle. Now when we hear cattle, we think cows, right? But really, this is a
collective word.
This is a more broad category of animals. So this would be animals, buffalo. Probably includes like sheep and rams and goats and things too, like hooved animals, things that are readily domesticated, probably a lot of things with hooves.
Well, when people say, "Oh, I have a cattle ranch,"
right?
Could like you said, buffalo, cows, goats.
But as a
collective,
usually everyday use, when we hear cattle, we think cows, right? This is a broad category. It's not one specific animal. These are categories of animals, and then you have creeping thing and beasts of the earth, and so. My understanding here would be that beasts of the earth would be like your bears,
lions,
cats,
tigers, bears,
dogs. And these some of the things that we would say like breeds of dogs didn't exist back then, but generally like canines, felines, probably elephants, like wild animals, right?
Okay.
And probably not so much the things with hooves. Maybe a lot of the things that we consider predators today, that would be beasts of the field.
Yeah.
And then creeping thing could include lizards, reptiles, things, especially things with short legs that are close to the ground. It could include rodents too, things that are just kind of, and potentially other bugs maybe fit into that category.
I think in New York, the rodents would be called beasts of the earth.
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to say going from one language to another if you try to put every animal.
That's interesting.
You can see that it kind of covers everything, but where we draw the line compared to where the Hebrew categories draw the line, it's a little fuzzy, but you kind of get a sense of it. So one of the ways it's sort of helpful to try to understand how this works is when you look at how this is translated in the past. So the Greek Septuagint was translated a couple of centuries before Jesus was born by Hebrew scholars, a team of 70, 72 maybe. But that's why the word Septuagint means 70. And so you have this translation that was commissioned to preserve the Hebrew scriptures in Greek, which was the common language at that time. And when you're going from one language to another, now you have the Hebrew scholars interpreting their scriptures into another language. And that again, has some of these different nuances that Hebrew did. So you can see where they made the judgment call of which Greek word to use. So just as an example, this word that we have translated as bird here, when that was translated into the Septuagint, it was this second word at the bottom there. I don't know how to pronounce it exactly, petanon. That's flying creature. So where it says Greek equivalent word, that shows the different words that this word, which is oath in Hebrew.
Oath?
Yeah, so you see here, this is the word, it's small, yeah. So this is the Hebrew word. These are two different words that it's translated into in Greek. The word that's being, bird here and there and there. So that is translated, when they translate into Greek, they use this word, which means flying creature, as opposed to this word, which means bird. This is ornithon, this is like where we get ornithology. So that word is specifically birds, but the Greeks, or the Hebrew translators, when they translate it into Greek, recognize this is not limited to birds, right? So in the New King James here, it's translated as bird. It's not perfect. We don't really have a word for that, petanon.
Just
other than flying creatures, right? So
just curious, not wanting to dissect the frog, but you said flying creatures and then you said bats. I never even thought of bats.
yeah,
If you look at a bat, would that go into the ornithology department?
well, this would be
because I know Greeks had one word for each one.
well, in Leviticus we see that bat is mentioned in Leviticus 11. This is a passage of birds that God told the Israelites they were not to eat, they were considered unclean. These are unclean birds. And if you look at sort of the pattern, we got vultures, eagles, owls. These seem to be things that either are predators or scavengers, as opposed to like seed-eating birds, right?
Yeah.
And at the end, the bat is included. So among the birds, the bat. Sometimes you'll get critics, skeptics, scoffers who go, look how dumb the Bible is. God thinks that the bat is a bird, right? But that word bird, again, when you looked at which of these two words were used in the Septuagint, it was the one that was flying creatures.
Yeah.
So anytime you're reading, whatever English version of the Bible you're reading, it's important to be aware of the fact that you are reading a translation. And so sometimes when something seems just a little odd like this, you can understand that if you dig a little deeper, you see that some of this nuance gets lost in translation, right? So it's not that bird is a terrible word here, it's just that we don't have a word that really means, you could put flying creatures, but
it's boring.
But then, they wouldn't be eating flies
But I think
either,
that's interesting.
right?
You said seed versus, because I know owls eat rats.
Yeah.
So
that seems to be the pattern here. If I'm looking at, eagle, vulture, buzzard, falcon, raven. I'm not sure. Do ostriches? What are they? I don't know.
What?
An ostrich. I don't know.
Ostrich? They don't fly.
Hawk. Well, yeah, they do have wings and feathers. So it's again, it's kind of
Chickens
right.
don't fly.
Yeah, but you'd still call them a bird, right? But if you said, "What's a bird?"
Yeah.
Birds have feathers. They fly. And so, an ostrich is sort of an exception, right? We still categorize it as a bird, but we generally define birds
They go like a
as
short
something that
distance.
flies. I think they flap their wings when they're running, an ostrich, But it's one of those things where, like, when you try to define something,
Penguins.
sometimes there's little exceptions to the rule, right? So just
And Lou just said penguins. I forgot about penguins.
yeah.
Dear babies. Yeah.
So in Genesis 7, we read the creatures that God brought to the ark for Noah, and you see the categories compared to Genesis 1. We see the beast, the cattle, the creeping thing, and the birds. What don't we see? We don't see sea creatures, right?
Mm-hmm. We don't see unicorns.
Yeah, there's a song about that. And it also says, all flesh in which is the breath of life. A little later in the chapter, it says that everything that had the breath of life in its nostrils perished that wasn't on the ark. And so that gives you a sense, this is talking about things that breathe. Again, that wouldn't include sea creatures. It also, I don't picture, as the animals are congregating to the ark, a parade of bugs. Bugs don't breathe through nostrils. They aspirate through their exoskeletons. Not that there wouldn't have been any bugs on the ark, just because, bugs
Well, some
can
of
be.
them hung out on animals.
Right, or, could have made their way on there, but they're also very resilient in general, that they may have been able to, a lot of them could have survived apart from the ark.
Yeah.
I don't picture, like, here come the two spiders,
Yeah.
They could have survived on any floating debris.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
I mean, there's other ways
There
they
had to
could
have
have
been a lot
survived.
of floating debris.
Right. There's other means that they could have survived apart from the ark. But again, that doesn't mean there wouldn't have been any bugs on the ark either. It's just there weren't specifically included in what was being.
Yeah, but isn't it good to know that Noah probably didn't invite mosquitoes?
That's sort of what I'm getting at. Yeah. They were just like the sea creatures. They were kind of okay. So we're going to look here at Job, the later chapters of Job, where God is sort of putting Job in his place.
I didn't know Job was the oldest book in the
Yeah.
Bible.
It seems to be. When you read like the time period of when Job lived, it says he was from the land of Uz.
But when was
Leaves
Genesis?
that land.
So in Genesis we read the account of Adam and Noah and everything, but it was written by Moses through inspiration from God, and that was in the 1500 BC time frame. Whereas the patriarchs, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, they were from about 500 years earlier, and that seems to be sort of contemporary to when Job lived. It's pretty clear when you're reading Job that there was no Mosaic law in place yet, so he predated Moses, right? So his book, chronologically, it's not older than Genesis as far as when it takes place. It would have taken place sometime in Genesis, because Genesis spans from Adam through the patriarchs Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. It's interesting, though, because being the most ancient book, you see some insights that, we tend to have this idea that people in the ancient world didn't know a lot of things that we know today. And it's sort of surprising when you see the things that they did know. One of the things, I don't have it in my presentation here, but God mentions when he's talking about all these things that he had done, he says that he hung the earth on nothing, right? And that's a pretty spot on description of the way the earth is suspended in space and yet stable in its orbit and on its axis, that compared to some other ancient beliefs that maybe we were riding on the back of a turtle or on some pillar or something like that.
Atlas is holiness, huh?
Yeah, things like that, right? So in Job 40, we get this description where God shows Job the behemoth. And we don't really know. That's a transliterated word. What does that correspond to as far as we know? And when we see the description of it, we see, because sometimes people say, well, maybe it was a crocodile, maybe it was an elephant or a hippo. Right. So I think he eats grass like an ox. That rules out crocodiles, alligators. God says his strength is in his hips, his power is in his stomach muscles, or as King James says, his belly. His tail is like a cedar, so that kind of rules out hippos, rhinos, elephants. They all have kind of dinky, either sapling-looking tails, or like the hippo just has this little nub. And his sinews of his thighs are tightly knit, which gives you the idea he's got powerful legs. The mountains yield food for him. That could mean, it could be a reference to his height. It could be a reference to his, where he goes. Where, if that's the case, that would be another thing that would rule against a lot of those crocodiles and hippos that stay near the
He
water.
could really go wherever he wanted.
Right. It could, it seems, I would guess it means that, but it could also, be a reference to his height, not sure.
Yeah.
And that the river may rage, yet he is not disturbed. So I think this sort of dinosaur, a sauropod, this is like Titanosaur, Brachiosaurus, they're the largest type of dinosaurs that we've discovered. And he seems to fit all of the descriptions in Job. So I've never really heard anything else proposed that sort of checks all these boxes. So I think that behemoth was a dinosaur, and specifically something in this subtype of dinosaur that we used to call them brontosaurus, but I guess that word you don't use anymore. You're familiar with, everyone's seen this dinosaur. I think it's a gas station logo out west, right? So, you've probably seen this before if you've ever eaten at a Chinese restaurant. But you're looking horse, sheep, monkey, pig, dog, tiger. And then there's a dragon on there, right? And doesn't it seem peculiar that the Chinese zodiac would have 11 real life animals and then a mythical creature thrown into the mix? It's kind of bizarre, right? So what is the difference between a dragon and a dinosaur?
One breathes fire and the other one doesn't.
Okay. I mean, how do we know if any of the dinosaurs breathe fire? All we have is their bones, right?
Yeah.
But as far as like their physical description, they're big lizards. Some of them are on 2 legs, some of them are on 4 legs. A lot of them have long necks. A lot of them are kind of serpentine when they're,
Isn't there
long and
there's
slender.
an animal that's called what kind of dragon?
The Komodo dragon.
Komodo dragon.
Yeah,
But that's like a big lizard, right?
yeah, yeah.
I mean, it's not dragon-esque, like.
This is there's different stylized dragons of fantasy, right? Like not every dragon is based 100% on a dinosaur, right? But as sort of like a class of animal, a category of animal, there seems to be a lot of overlap, other than the idea that dinosaurs existed and dragons didn't, and that dragons sometimes could breathe fire. But some of them are winged, some of them walk on two legs, they have scales, some of them have spikes or, pointy areas, horns, whatever, right? It's kind of hard if you try to decide to describe dinosaurs generally.
Yeah.
There's a lot of variation, right? And the same for dragons. So in Job 41, this is right after the behemoth is presented to Job, we're told about the Leviathan. And this is apparently a sea-dwelling, I'm going to say dinosaur, creature, because there's references to harpoons and fishing spears not being able to capture him. He's mentioned as having terrible teeth and rows of scales, so we're not talking about a whale or anything like that. Then it gets really interesting in verse 18. His sneezings flash forth light, out of his mouth go burning lights, sparks of fire shoot out, smoke goes out of his nostrils. His breath kindles coals, and a flame goes out of his mouth. So
That's where we get the fire.
it sounds like a fire-breathing dragon, and this is not being described as fiction. This is a historical. It's presented as real, right?
Uh-huh.
Wow.
So according to Job, there was fire-breathing reptile. At least this type of fire-breathing reptile in the sea. Reading on, we get a description that his strength dwells in his neck, which I think means he had a thick neck. This particular Leviathan that was being described had a thick neck, which is distinct from a lot of dinosaurs, kind of have like a slender neck or a narrow neck. And he's very large because he raises himself up. The mighty are afraid. Because of his crashings, they are beside themselves. So you picture like a whale comes up out of the water and crashes down. This is a big animal. It talks about javelins and arrows are like straw to him. Like the idea of fighting and taking down this creature, like your weapons are useless against him, right? He's big and strong. It mentions his undersides being like pot shards, so he must have some kind of sharp, scales on his undersides that says mark the mire. So if the soft ground would leave these traces. So I was sort of going to leave this open. Like I didn't really have anything that I thought specifically came to mind, like a familiar dinosaur. But Lana told me I should point out that Mosasaurus really fits the bill pretty well. This was in Jurassic World, if anyone's seen that movie. And it was a very kind of large one of these. I think that image is actually something, the way it was represented in that movie. But you see an idea of its scale there up on the top. Of course, dinosaurs are thought to, reptiles in general, they never really stop growing. So the longer they live, the bigger they get. So we can kind of estimate their size based on ones that have been found, but we don't know when we find something if that's as big as they ever got. But that gives you an idea of the scale of ones that have been uncovered. And there's a picture. I like to put a picture of the skeleton too, because anytime you have an artist rendition, there's a lot of speculation that goes into it. So you have what we understand the skeleton to look like and what they think maybe it looked like. You see too, it kind of has that long, slender serpentine shape to it. So in Isaiah 27, verse 1, the Leviathan's mentioned there as well. It calls the Leviathan the fleeing serpent, the twisted serpent, and he will slay the reptile that is in the sea. So you've got these two words. One here in the New King James is translated as serpent, the other one's reptile. So when you look at the Hebrew words there and where else those are used, the word serpent is pretty consistently translated as serpent. But again, in everyday language, we usually use serpent to mean snake, but this is a little bit broader than that. I think this is any reptile that has that sort of serpentine quality to it where it's long and slender. Like the Leviathan we saw, it kind of has that S shape to it, right? So all snakes are serpents, but all serpents are not necessarily snakes. It's a little bit more broad. And then the word reptile here in New King James, that's this bottom word, which is tanim or tanin. That is a dragon. It's translated as a dragon or a serpent or a sea monster. Again, kind of a broad word. But when you look at where that word is used, so again, the word that was translated serpent there, I'm not going to show because it's pretty consistently serpent. But this is all the renderings of that second word that in the New King James was reptile. So wherever that's used, I've got the New King James text here. And I know this is an eye chart, so I've color-coded it. So
Well, I'm wondering about Genesis, when Eve encountered the serpent.
that was the first word.
But
So
he
that was serpent.
Right, but he was not a ground creature at that time.
Well,
Just
because it
remember-
says he was cursed to crawl on his
Cursed
belly.
to crawl.
Yeah. So,
So,
we don't know exactly. We understand that was like a manifestation of Satan, but
yeah, okay.
Norm?
Just a couple quick questions. Were dinosaurs on the ark? And the second question is, with why would the Lord allow them to be extinct if they're such a powerful, animal?
Well, they were on the ark because they breathe through nostrils. Now, not all of them. The sea ones wouldn't have been, right? But the ones that lived out of the water would have been on the ark. Now, was there a ginormous, brachiosaurus on the ark? I think that God would have had the wisdom to take smaller specimens,
Yeah.
juveniles, So post-flood, the flood was such a catastrophic event. The world is a very different place than it was before. So the dinosaurs that we find, and we're going to be talking about this in the next couple months, we're going to spend a lot of time studying the flood, and it's the world as it is now, how it got that way due to the flood. Because virtually the entire world is evidence that the world was flooded. It's right in front of our faces, but a lot of times we don't see it. The fossils that we see are almost all of the fossils that we call the fossil record is actually things that died in the flood. So the dinosaurs that we find, the dinosaur fossils, are dinosaurs that died in the flood, but they didn't become extinct in the flood because there were some on the ark. Now, there's a lot of things that could have gone extinct in the years following the flood because, the world was in ruins and vegetation and different things were different. But I think we're going to see, we're going to get to it. I don't think they died went extinct in the flood event, that they continued to be around for a long time after that. But they seem to be extinct today, right? And we seem to have forgotten that they were ever real. We're talking about dragons, right? Once they've been extinct for a while, we start to think that they were myths. But then we uncover them in the ground and we go, oh, look, a dinosaur, right? So you find a dead dragon, you call it something new, and you deny that dragons ever existed, right? So what we see here, all these references where that Hebrew word is translated in the 1611 King James and in the Septuagint, which was translated about 200 years before Christ, they were comfortable using the word dragon. Our word dragon comes from the Greek word drakon, which is, you can see in the column on the right, all these places where this creature that's the Leviathan is described as was translated by Hebrew scholars 200 years before Jesus was born. They translated most of those renderings as dragon. the King James in the 1600 time period, they were still comfortable translating that word. They took the Greek word and often just transliterated that into English, which is our word dragon. That's all that is. And so the word dragon's used many times. Then people today will look at the King James Bible and go, look, the Bible says dragons were real. And they, just like they do with the bats and the birds, they look at that as a reason to scoff. But it's just dinosaurs, right?
I seem to remember in world history there was a ruler, a dictator, Dracon, where we get draconian.
Yeah.
Is that related?
Draco. Yeah, the word Draco means dragon. That word, it's a Greek root. Yeah, you're right.
So I guess I was wondering which came first.
I think he was named after the creature. I don't remember when he lived, but it would have been more recent than I think the Greek word Draco or Dracon isn't, I don't think, describing him, but I don't know if Lou might know better than me, but the only time the New King James uses now the New King James is from 1982, and all of the places that used to say dragon in the King James, they put something else in you can see the one that has the text. The only place that's green is in Revelation. There's 13 times that this dragon is mentioned, and it's obviously alluding to Satan. But
So they're using monster instead, huh?
well, right, they use monster, serpent, in some places jackal. It seems to use jackal when it's paired up with another creature like hyena. But there's this, it seems like a reticence to use the word dragon because dragons aren't real, right? But you see that it's kind of a bias in our culture, recent culture. We've come to think that dragons aren't real. And so they don't want to translate that into dragon. But in 1611, they were fine with it. In 200 BC, they were fine with it.
Who's they?
The translators, right? The people who work on the King James Bible,
So
they use
wanted,
the word dragon.
They wanted to put it the way they want it?
Well, it's a matter of if you're translating it and you go, okay, what's this Hebrew word mean? People today are going to be reluctant to put, well, they're talking about dragon because there are no dragons, so they think, right? So there's going to be a bias against using the word dragon today, right? In 1982, for instance, right? All those renderings that used to be translated as dragon, the 1982 translators of the New King James decided to use something other than dragon for all this. Yeah, it's kind of funny that they'll use monster.
Yeah, what's a
Because
monster?
monsters aren't real either.
No.
But you could call a big scary animal a monster, right? So it's just, you could just see like kind of that bias creeping in of the idea that dragons aren't real. What about outside of the Bible? Is there evidence that dinosaurs and people coexisted? This is a Mesopotamian jasper cylinder that's on display at the Louvre. They say it's from 3500 BC. I think that date's a little off because that would put it pre-flood. But this is probably very ancient,
Do you think
because,
just because it's in the Louvre that it gives it credibility?
well, it's just that that's where it is. It's, if you want to go see it, that's where you'll find it.
Pre-archaeology, so it shows
Right.
that someone must have seen.
Right. So yeah, somebody uncovered this, and this is the kind of thing you look at it, you go, oh look, they carved a dragon on it, but it looks like a stylized version of a behemoth or one of these sauropods, right?
And giraffes do that too, that insert one
Yeah.
and twiny thing.
But you see, it's got a very long tail,
Yes.
a very long neck, and it's kind of bumpy. Like it's not a giraffe, right?
Oh, no.
But not that they probably were carving this thing while looking at it, but you get the impression that they're either basing it on something they've seen or basing it on something that somebody else saw. Sometimes you get the telephone game with these depictions that become more stylized
Right.
as you get farther away from the original observer. But the idea is that this was probably based on something. These dragons, they're all over the world, right? Chinese have their dragons, Europeans have their dragon from mythos.
Loch
Like
Ness
it's sort of
Monster, yeah.
it's sort of ubiquitous. Like you have regional mythical creatures, but this one's sort of universal, right? There's some variation of dragons all over the world. This is a 800-year-old Buddhist temple it was kind of excavated. There's a picture. A lot of these images come from this website, Genesis Park, where they've kind of compiled a lot of these relics and
Yeah.
things of dragons throughout history. And so this used to be all covered in vines and stuff, and it's been excavated. And they find these carvings on there of these different animals. You see, like right here, there's a monkey. It's kind of stylized, right? But you can sort of recognize that it's a monkey.
Uh-huh.
There's different animals, and this one that the guy's cradling there, it sure looks like a stegosaurus, right? I mean, it's got those
It's like a rhino.
polygon, but it's got these spines on the back, right?
Yeah.
And some skeptics will say, well, maybe it was a rhino, and that's just like petals behind it. But based on the depth of those, it looks like it's part of the animal, not something behind the animal, the way it's portrayed. And some people say, but a stegosaurus had spikes on its tail. It's like, well, okay, it's not perfect, but if a kid drew this picture, you would recognize that your kid is trying to draw a stegosaurus,
Yeah.
right? I mean, it looks more like a stegosaurus than anything else. This is a depiction. There's actually a lot of artwork depicting this St. George slaying a dragon. This one, I think, is the most pretty and interesting, and that the dragon looks like something that we could recognize.
Yeah.
This is from around 1500. There's a lot of paintings of him on a horse stabbing a dragon on the ground with a spear, and it looks a lot like the Nothosaurus. You see, it's got it's not quite a crocodile or an alligator. It's got this long neck that's narrow,
Yeah.
and he's got that long neck too, and the size is about right based on specimens that have been found.
I'm amazed at the talent of the artwork of that painting.
Yeah, it's really
The
beautiful.
detail.
Yeah, it's actually a tapestry. So
Oh, is it even more so?
yeah, or an altar cloth they call it. These are from around that same time period, like in the 1500s. This image of a dragon, you can see it's breathing fire. They all look kind of
Long neck and long
like
tail.
style of the time, right? And they look a lot like this.
Oh, and they have webbed feet, look.
Yeah, the mouth goes way back. I mean, the head on that first image compared to that rendering at the bottom, I mean, they look virtually identical. Now, Leonardo da Vinci was an artist, so obviously he could have been creating fantastical things, but it's just kind of interesting here. I just wanted to include this. This is a drawing he did called Cats, Lions, and a Dragon. And so it's just a bunch of sketches of cats looking cute and rolling around, and there's this one here looks like a mountain lion type thing, and then right here is a dragon.
Oh, yeah.
So maybe he was
Same size as the cat.
well. I mean, they're not to
Sketches.
scale because this looks like a house cat and it's bigger than this lion, right?
Mm.
So they're just sketches, and maybe it was just a made up thing, but it's just kind of interesting that and he's from around that same time period, like 1500s.
Mhm.
So it seems like in the 1500s, we would say, well, St. George, or was it St. George?
St. George the Dragon.
Yeah, that he never slayed a dragon, but why not, right? Like that's something we assume isn't true because we assume that dragons aren't real, but yet we know that dinosaurs existed. So why couldn't it have been
Yeah.
real? It seems like 500 years ago, people thought that dragons were real. If no one had ever seen a dragon, then coming up with a story and inspiring all this artwork that you slayed a dragon, that seems unlikely. It seems like it would be based on something real. Even if the paintings, it's not like someone looked at the actual thing that he slayed, so you have some that are more stylized than others. But it seems like it was based on some sort of reality, right? And it's kind of remarkable that some of those drawings look like things that we actually have found in the fossils, right?
Mhm.
And then there's this guy. This is a relatively recent type of dinosaur fossil that's been discovered less than 20 years ago. And so they named it the Dracorex Hogwartsia, which means the Dragon King of Hogwarts. So
What's a
obviously
Hogwarts?
that's where Harry Potter goes to school.
Oh.
So it's it's a very contemporary name. The people who named it obviously were Harry Potter fans.
Okay.
But they called it Dracorex because it looks like exactly like fantasy type dragons of especially like the European variety. It's got the horns and the spikes. And this display is in a children's museum in Indianapolis, and they call it the new type of dinosaur that looks like a dragon. So it feels like we've come full circle.
Yeah.
Okay, so are the pictures there on the right based, are they just
Rendering.
renderings? Yeah, thank you.
This is what's on display. You know, it is a fossil, right? So
The one on the left is a fossil. They actually
Yeah.
found that. The
right.
rest of it they didn't actually find. That's just a rendering, correct?
I'm not 100% sure because when they show these in museums, a lot of times the actual fossil is a small bit of what they show.
Exactly.
So actually, that's a good question. I don't know how much of the body they found, but I do know that head is a fossil, and it's on display in a lot of places. Castings of it, I don't know. I'll have to-
And then
I'll
they
have to
date
look.
those, right? Yeah.
No, I mean, if there's no soft tissue there to be dated, but even as we know, even when they do, they're reluctant to do it. But it's been done, right? So it's just that this dragon in particular, I think this is my new favorite dinosaur because that's just fantastic looking. I mean, it looks right out of like a Harry Potter type movie or something like that with those horns and the spikes. But it's like it's right in front of these people, right? Like dragons aren't real. Oh, we found these big lizards. Let's call them dinosaurs. And then, hey, this one in particular looks a lot like what we think of a dragon. But, but it all comes back to that worldview presupposition that dinosaurs and humans didn't live at the same time. Therefore, any dragon sighting or dinosaur sighting from a person is pretend. But yet, they can't deny that these things sure look like dragons. I mean, they kind of brag about it here, right? But because of that worldview, that presupposition that dinosaurs and people didn't live together, they'll never call dinosaurs dragons. And they'll mock the Bible for talking about dragons because everyone knows dragons aren't real. Oh, look, a dinosaur. Oh, look, this one looks a lot like a dragon. So that's it. So let's see, what time is it? 10:36. So in the weeks to come, what I'd like to do, this will be the end of the dinosaur talk, but we're going to move into a study of primarily the flood, but also the creation week and the way the world was set up before the flood and the sequence of events. The best model by far that I've seen, because there's different, you've probably heard in school you were taught plate tectonics, the idea that the continents are drifting, that there's ocean floor separation, and they're moving away from each other at like an inch a year, like the rate that your fingernails grow. And so if you go back, so far, you can see where they came from. Then there's some different creation/flood models. A lot of you have probably heard of the canopy theory that was popular for a long time, although that's really severely fallen out of favor because it's just not workable. The idea that the bulk of the flood water was up in the atmosphere, either as some sort of solid ice or something. The problem with that, if you start to calculate like how much water would have had to been up there, even if 4 inches worth of water were up there, the greenhouse effect on the planet would have been so severe that nothing could have lived. So it doesn't seem to work. So what we're going to do is we're going to go through the Bible, like in Genesis 1, and sort of get a picture of what we tend to read Genesis 1 again with sort of a bias of picturing the way the world is now, and you're kind of missing that it was different before the flood. There were some things about the world that are different. For instance, you didn't have a mile of sedimentary rock all over the world because that was laid down in the flood. Sediment is, those layers of rock that gets put down by liquid when there's, things settling out of liquid. So we're gonna kind of look at that with a keen focus on what things would have been like leading up to the flood, and then what was happening during the flood. And you'd be amazed when you look at the world and things like the mountain ranges, like for instance that a lot of the ones, especially in the Americas, run north to south, and they are on the west side of the continents. You've got a lot of things going on under the ocean that you don't see on a normal map, but if you look at a map, and we will, of the ocean floor, you've got the mid-oceanic ridge, which is a mountain range that winds all under the oceans, and they look different than the mountain ranges that we're familiar with. They've got these cracks, both parallel and perpendicular to the mountain range, so it looks like they were stretched rather than compressed. And there's what looks sort of like a scar running north and south in the Indian Ocean below the Himalayas. And there's you may have heard of the Ring of Fire, which is the volcanic activity that happens around the Pacific. And then there's like 40,000 volcanic peaks in the Pacific Ocean,
Wow.
which is not something you see anywhere else.
Is that where you get tsunamis?
What's that?
Is that where you would get tsunamis?
I
if
think
they
so.
erupt?
Yeah. You get some earthquakes, and still we'll see that earthquakes when the land is sort of shifting a little bit. Earthquakes, if you draw vectors of the direction they go, they all end up sort of pointing towards that ring of fire, as if things are like nudging in that direction. And when we go through Genesis 1, and we'll go through the other places, there's actually the flood is talked about a lot in Scripture, not just in the early chapters of Genesis, but even in the New Testament. Jesus refers to the days of Noah, Peter. You read a lot of it in Psalms and some other places where it's being referred to as something that happened, like a historical event. And it is one of the most significant historical events ever, right? I'd put it definitely in the top 5, including like the incarnation, creation itself. But anyway, that's what we're leading into, and we'll get started on that next week. And there's some great videos that we'll look at too that'll tie all these features of the world. You'll see where they came from. So that's it for today.